what a game without a player character is? A movie. I don't know why I use that as my opening line, honestly, though that is the focus of today's video, the player characters of Darktide, our rejects. You may not have known this, but some of the choices you make for your character have lore connections to the 40k universe at large, especially your class choice. So pull up that character creator, question why this is a hairstyle you can even choose, and let's get into the details lovingly crafted for Darktide's very own rejects. Obey my cat! Hit the subscribe button. When you go to make a reject, the very first thing you'll pick is your class, and this is the meat and potatoes of 40k lore where Darktide's rejects are concerned, so I'm actually going to save this for last. Sorry. Instead, we'll start by looking at the different planets you can select for your homeworld. All but one, Cadia, are planets within the Mobian domain that have actually never existed elsewhere in 40k lore, but we still get to know a bit about them through flavor texts of the planets, some cosmetics, and various voice lines and events in the game. Your homeworld planets of choice are Crucius, Messalina Gloriana, Rosaria, however you say that, Branx Magna, Inkron, Cadia, Mornax, and Pavan. Or Pavane? Messalina Gloriana is named after Saint Messalina, who is a central character in Mobian history. She was a woman who was steadfast in her devotion to the Emperor, and long ago led Mobian forces in a crusade against the unfaithful. This included corrupt leaders of different planets, and she ended up beheading several of them on a moon of Branx Magna. As far as we know, she was a true woman of the people and beloved by her devoted followers. Messalina herself tried to downplay her importance to both her followers and the domain at large, not wanting to become a subject of worship in fear it would detract people from their devotion to the Emperor of Mankind. Eventually, she was betrayed and killed, probably because beheading nobles is generally not a popular move amongst the rich and powerful. After her death, she was canonized as a saint, and the moon of Messalina Gloriana named after her. This moon is of major strategic importance within the Mobian domain, as it now serves as the primary defensible bastion between the core of the Mobian domain proper and its fringes, where the collective enemies of mankind like aliens, heretics, and other unknowable horrors lurks, known as the Darktide. Branx Magna is another planet we know a little bit about. For one, the Branx pickaxe Ogrons can carry is named after it, and that's because the planet is known for its incredible industrial production and resource-rich moons that are heavily mined. Branx is the most densely populated planet in the entire domain and comes close to competing with Atoma Prime in its production. The ruling noble house of the planet are the Van Sparzes, and they're mentioned by Stephanie as one of the squabbling children of power players in the domain.
Margrave, Barquette, Consora, Van Sparzi. Children squabbling in the dust.
The different noble families historically have warred for power, the most prominent being House Margrave and House Barquette, as Margrave usurped Barquette for control over the capital planet of Atoma Prime. Now, if you know anything about history and capitals, even in our real world, it isn't terribly uncommon for someone in a position of power in a larger, more populated and prosperous city to make a bid for power to become the new capital of a country or empire. And while this is completely speculation on my part, there might be some little red flags that a political shakeup attempt might be afoot when it comes to the position of Branx Magna and the Van Sparzes. Commissar Duquesne of the Mobian 53rd Regiment is actually from Branx Magna, as is the entire 53rd. In her missives reporting on the situation in Tertium, she says, "The 53rd Steelheads are proud soldiers, impeccable in their loyalty. Moreover, as I need not remind you, they are Branx born. Like their birth world, they are young and aspirational. Atoma Prime has ruled the domain for too long. It has grown fat and lazy and slumped into privileged corruption. How else can one explain the gross deviation of their infamous six? Atoma and the Lord Margrave has allowed this treason to breed." It's important to note that Duquesne isn't writing these reports to the Van Sparzes directly, but there is still some not so subtle subtext that she believes the days of Margrave and Atoma Prime being the jewel of the Mobian domain should be over, and she likely isn't the only one. Now that she's firmly planted herself as an important player in the events of the ongoing war within Tertium, it will be interesting to see if her attitudes and beliefs about what is at the core of the rot proves correct, or if her perspective evolves over time. The last planet I'll talk about is Cadia, because Cadia is important and a major event in existing 40k lore. Cadia was a planet relatively close to the sector that's home to the Mobian domain. And I say it was a planet because, as you see on the planet selection screen, it's now a very small asteroid belt. Cadia actually has everything to do with the Cicatrix Maledictum. Sometime in the last 10 to 20-ish years before Darktide happens, a really big, bad, and mean guy who was champion of all 4 Chaos Gods named Abaddon the Despoiler was getting really frustrated because he kept trying to launch heretic crusades against the Imperium of Mankind, and they kept failing. And also because his arms kept falling off. At the time, the only place in the galaxy a massive fleet could enter or exit the warp was a gateway called the Eye of Terror, and Cadia sat right at the cusp of this rift. Cadia was a fortress planet of some of the best soldiers the Guard has ever known. This was out of necessity because being right next to the main gateway in or out of actual hell, where the arch enemies of mankind would constantly try to get out from to fuck up everyone's day, Cadia had seen some shit. Many an attempted crusade broke against Cadia until Abaddon had had enough, and also probably a pretty bad tension headache from wearing his hair that tight, and he literally threw a massive fortress at the planet. When I say massive, this is 40k, so the scale of anything is really hard to get your head around. At least it is for me because everything is so extra. But by massive, I mean that this central chamber that you see on this Blackstone fortress is said to be 100 miles across. To put it in perspective, the state of Connecticut is about 110 miles wide. So imagine Connecticut here in the middle of this massive ship to help visualize that. That actually didn't really help. It's fucking big, you get it. This fortress, called the Will of Eternity, smashed into Cadia, and the planet destabilized and literally cracked apart. When Cadia broke apart, it caused an implosion of sorts within the Eye of Terror, and a massive fissure straight into the warp split open, sundering the galaxy in twain. That isn't actually the entire story. To get every detail as correct as I can, the fall of Cadia and the Cicatrix Maledictum would deserve their own video, but that's more or less the quick version. Basically, now we're left with half of the Milky Way galaxy that's still mostly business as usual, and the half that got stuck on the other side of the fissure that's now getting hardcore by demons with massive and live in literal hell daily. And if you choose Cadia as your home planet, you get to have purple eyes because it's a mutation humans from Cadia get due to their large exposure to the warp. That's pretty neat. Alright, so now that you've chosen what planet you're from, it's time to flesh out the rest of your backstory. Depending on your chosen planet and class, you might have been a hive gang member, a guy that scoops algae out of a pond with a spoon, an orphan. The possibilities are endlessly depressing. Look, it's 40k. If you think you were having a good time before you went to prison, you have not been paying attention. Speaking of prison, the ship the game's tutorial takes place on is called the Tankard Bastion, and it is a prison ship transporting you from presumably elsewhere in the Mobian domain to Atoma Prime, where you will either serve out a sentence that results in your death or just be outright executed. In the Imperium, there's over 2 ways to get punished. Most of them involve your death. As to why you find yourself in prison, really it could be anything. Superior officers told lies about you deserting your post?
Jail.
Stand in front of a magistrate on the street?
Jail.
Say you think your local deacon spends too much money on personal expenses?
Right to jail, right away.
Not enjoying your corpse starch?
Believe it or not, jail, right away.
Really, the only thing your choice of crime changes, aside from your personal headcanon, is the color clothes your reject starts out in. Okay, so we know what planet you're from, what your depressing backstory is before you went to prison, and also why you ended up in prison, but who are you? This is the most meaningful selection about your character you can make, the class. There are currently 4 classes to choose from, and suspiciously 5 character slots. Fat shark, what are you gonna bet? You can choose from Veteran, Zealot, Psyker, and Ogryn. Each one of these are humans, or humanesques, of the Imperium that have trained in a particular set of skills. Skills that make you a nightmare to heretics. A veteran is probably mostly exactly what you expect. They've proved their worth in numerous battles and have been one of the few to come back alive from vicious encounters time and time again. This feat alone is actually pretty damn significant because the Imperium's approach to warfare is we'll defeat them through skill or by crushing them with the weight afraid of our dead. They very much embrace the tactics of attrition, and if you're a trained soldier able to survive deployments multiple times over, you're either incredibly skilled or incredibly lucky, but realistically, hopefully both. Our veterans in Darktide are also titled sharpshooters, and they are deadly with a gun, no doubt. But guard veterans are known for being experts in melee combat and familiar with demolitions. They're also the kind of soldier that is perfectly suited for operating in a small squad of people with diverse backgrounds and going on missions that almost involve guerrilla-style tactics. As you might guess, a disposable meat shield that gets lucky enough to survive combat time after time tends to err on the side of non-standard when it comes to getting shit done and making sure they make it out alive. Every veteran will still operate within a traditional platoon structure, but almost as more of an individual. In fact, it isn't uncommon for the most hardened of veterans to be gathered across different legions and placed in squads with much less seasoned soldiers. And those soldiers they're in a squad with learn a lot, stuff they didn't learn in training, up until their inevitable and very sad deaths. Basically, veterans are more or less right at home with the rejects, even if the loose cannon personality is ready to derelict his duty at the drop of a hat again. Zealots, on the other hand, aren't really part of a military organization. Our zealot preachers come from a group known as the Adeptus Ministorum, aka the Ecclesiarchy, and they are the organization that are basically the keepers of the faith. And boy, do they take their job seriously. They're the people that spread the word of the Emperor and come up with all those awesome brainwashing dogmas you see on Darktide's load screen, like understanding weakens the will to act. The Emperor bestows upon us the gift of intolerance. And my personal favorite, hope is the first step on the road to disappointment. Zealots specifically are preachers that are particularly loud, fueled by rage and possibly vodka Red Bulls, and instead of blood coursing through their veins, they have fanatical devotion to the Emperor of Mankind. So where'd they learn to be so damn effective with a knife? Well, the Ministorum actually has a standing army. You may have heard of them. They're called the Sisters of Battle, which are basically warrior space nuns in varying degrees of states of being dressed. They're rad. There are also makeshift armies called the Fraternis Militius that are typically formed from an extremely passionate or angry mob ready to expel anyone participating in heretical cult activities in their good Imperium neighborhoods. Basically, they're just preachers that are from the formal religious organization who thinks that when they die, they're going to see the golden throne upon which the Emperor sits, and they're like, mega stoked for that. It can't come soon enough. So they throw themselves at every opportunity they get to both do the Emperor's good work, purge heretics and Xenos, and hopefully die in the process so they can finally have their happy day in the Emperor's golden light. If you've ever found yourself wondering why your zealot is such a dick to your fellow Psyker, and especially Ogryn rejects because Ogryns are perfect and pure and should be protected at all costs, it's because in a zealot's mind, the only human worthy of the Emperor's light are pure humans. Ogryns are what are known as abhumans or mutants, and as the saying goes, burn the heretic, kill the mutant, purge the unclean. They also have no love for Psykers because zealots consider them dangerous witches. And they basically are. Let's talk about that. Psykers are basically mutant humans with a natural ability to use magic, for all intents and purposes, by being able to exert their will into the warp and manipulate it. So the warp is a completely separate plane of existence parallel to the physical real world, and the warp is comprised entirely of psychic energy and emotion. It's like a realm of infinite magical possibilities if those possibilities also included the very likely scenario of you getting ripped apart by demons and your soul consumed by a malevolent psychic being that is basically a god fueled by all the emotions of humanity. It's not a great place. It's basically hell. So when you have a single person or even a bunch of people who have an innate ability to tap into that dimension and essentially use their mind as a mini gateway between the warp and the real world to manifest shit into existence, you can see how that might be extremely concerning. Sometimes people don't even know that they're Psykers, and crazy things can happen, like a demon pulls itself out of them like a rabbit from a hat and lays waste to an entire planet. And there are a lot more Psykers now than there used to be, because when the Cicatrix Maledictum split apart the galaxy, it also caused a great psychic awakening within humans who had a latent psychic ability within them that has now been unleashed due to the more powerful presence of warp in real space. But this also isn't necessarily a bad thing. Psykers are incredibly necessary to humanity. Because they can utilize the warp in a myriad of ways, Psykers who show potential by surviving horrifying and violent torture are often trained and made use of within the Imperium. Psykers are necessary for warp travel, which is how humans travel faster than light in 40K. Yep, They fly through the gates of hell to get places. Psykers are also used for subspace communication, so sending messages faster than light, especially in situations where reinforcements are needed in dire military situations. And as demonstrated by the Psyker rejects in Darktide, when on your side, they are formidable and powerful allies that can break open a crusher's head like a piñata. Our reject Psykers come in 3 different flavors. There's a Savant Psyker that was once a sanctioned Psyker and served as an enforcer, the Loner Psyker, who are unsanctioned Psykers, meaning that they were never trained and given the A-OK to exist, which explains their general bad attitude and disenfranchisement to the Imperium and the Emperor at large. Most unsanctioned Psykers end up as a spiritual snack sacrificed to the Emperor in a state of undeath on his golden throne, which, fair enough, I really wouldn't be stoked about that either. And then there's the Seer Psyker that's always talking about their beloved, which is heavily implied that this Psyker is hearing the voice of the God Emperor of mankind speak to them directly. However, the dangerous game you always have to play with a Psyker is this the Emperor that they hear, or is the Seer being manipulated by a demon of the warp or even the Chaos God Tzeentch himself and being tricked into believing they are hearing the Emperor? We simply don't know for sure, and likely never will. The Seer Psyker could also just be straight up insane, either from warp influence or having survived torture imposed by them by the Imperium, or both. Which brings us to our final class, the Ogryn. As previously mentioned, Ogryns are abhumans, which is basically a mutant offshoot of the human species that was forced to evolve to adapt to extreme conditions on a planet that humans colonized many millennia ago. Ogryns aren't actually the only abhumans in 40k, far from it in fact, but today we're just going to focus on them. Ogryns are giants. They tower over their fellow rejects and act as a loyal first line of defense, always ready to protect the little ones and their weird makeshift family. Ogryns are also physically intimidating. In point-for-point combat on the tabletop, Ogryns are actually just as tough and potentially deadly as Space Marines, and really can often best a Space Marine in one-to-one combat. So when you consider that Space Marines are considered the pinnacle of human creation, the most deadly, frightening, awe-inducing spectacle on the battlefield, and even they have the potential to get backhanded into oblivion by this guy, that should at least make you pause before considering sneaking some of the Ogryn's rations in the mess hall. Now, where Ogryns become less of a threat than a Space Marine in lore is that, and you may have picked up on this by now, they are simple guys. Our Ogryn characters in Darktide are wholesome, endearing, and unwaveringly loyal and friendly, all characteristics often found in Ogryns that live amongst humans. But they aren't the brightest crayons in the box, which actually makes them ideal soldiers. They're loyal to a fault, will easily accept orders, and can snap a regular guy in half like a toothpick. Ogryns that show a particularly high level of intelligence are selected to undergo a process called a biochemical Ogryn neural enhancement, or BONE, which is what's known as a bonehead implant. So if you hear your Ogryn say a line about how his bonehead is acting up, just know that you're one of the proud few that stood as a cut above the rest in Ogryn school. We're proud of you, soldier. All right, guys, let me hear in the comments. What are your backstories and headcanons for your characters? Or what's your favorite class to play? What do you think the ultimate fate of our beloved rejects will be? Until next time, hold the line and purge the heretics. I'll see you out there against the Darktide. Thanks so much as always to my incredible supporters, Leah S over on Patreon, and Rue on Top, Comadre, Daniel Gerber, Big Guy, Rot, Ason, Living Zombie, Zello Snowed, Sir Pubert, Arch Dornan, and David Stoddard, who are YouTube channel members.